July 4, 1848, Tennessee. A day when the air burned with heat and gunpowder smoke. A day when the white families of the plantation gathered in their finest clothes to celebrate freedom, liberty, independence. They called it the Independence Day Feast. Harriet, that was her name. 26 years old, her back lined with scars that looked like rivers carved by fire. The scars were silent, but they spoke every day. She was not free. She was not independent. She was a woman chained in the heart of Tennessee, forced to cook, to serve, to bow her head while the sky filled with fireworks she was never meant to watch. The plantation belonged to the Whitmore family. Thomas Whitmore, the master, his wife, Margaret, their sons and daughters, pale and loud, laughing through the heat of summer. Neighbors arrived too, planters, overseers, men whose boots carried mud and cruelty. Harriet remembered their names like stones in her chest. She remembered William Harker, the overseer who lashed Samuel until his back bled raw. She remembered Jonathan Pike, the planter who took Rachel away into the woods and brought her back, broken. She remembered the children of the big house who laughed when Eliza dropped a tray and whipped her hands until she bled. Harriet didn't cry. She just worked. She just cooked. She just carried the silence with her. The feast was being prepared. The smell of roasting pork, the sweet pies, the cider. Harriet's hands moved across knives, herbs, pots. She stirred, she tasted, she carried plates heavy with food that was never hers to eat. Every clang of iron pots was a reminder of the chains around her. Every spark of the fire reminded her of the fireworks that would fill the sky later. Fire for them meant celebration. For Harriet, fire meant something else. She was quiet, too quiet. Her silence was not emptiness. Her silence was gathering. The others did not see it. To them, Harriet was another slave, another hand in the kitchen, another body bent low. But she was watching. Every laugh, every careless cruelty, every bite of food prepared by her hands, they were seeds planted in her memory. And one day, those seeds would bloom in fire and poison. They called it a feast. They called it freedom. But for Harriet, the feast was something else. It was a stage. It was a chance. She looked at the table being prepared in the Whitmore house, long white cloth, candles standing tall, plates polished until they shone like mirrors. 10 white people would sit there that evening, 10 mouths to feed, 10 names to remember, 10 faces that had never seen her as human. The heat pressed down heavy on Tennessee that morning. The fields shimmered with light. The cicadas screamed their endless song. Smoke from the fire pit stung Harriet's eyes as she stirred the broth. She didn't blink, she didn't cry, she just remembered. Her mother's name was Dinah, Dinah, who had been sold when Harriet was 14. She remembered the sound of chains dragging her mother away. She remembered her brother Elijah, whipped until his bones shone through skin. She remembered Ruth, her sister, dead in the field, buried without a marker. She remembered every name. She whispered them under her breath as she worked. Dinah, Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. The names were a prayer, a curse, a promise. Not because she wanted pity, not because she wanted mercy, but because she remembered. The knife in her hand-sliced meat. It wasn't for the master's table, not anymore. It was for something else. The Whitmores laughed in the parlor, their neighbors talking politics, celebrating America's future. Fireworks were already being set up in the E.T. yard. Harriet carried trays past them, invisible in her silence. But inside her something burned hotter than the Tennessee sun. One for Dinah, one for Elijah, one for Ruth, one for Rachel, one for Eliza, one for Samuel, one for every name she carried in her bones. This is the true story of Harriet, the slave, of Tennessee, who turned the master's feast into her reckoning. The story of a woman who poisoned 10 white people on the day they called independence. Before we continue with the video, drop a comment telling us where you're from and what time it is over there. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel. Migitin, fields of Tennessee stretched wide under a burning sun. Cotton, endless cotton, sharp bowls cutting into fingers until blood mixed with white fiber. Harriet's hands bore the marks of years in those fields. even though the Whitmores had shifted her into the kitchen. The scars never left. They never softened. Morning began before the sun. The bell rang, iron against iron, shattering the thin line between sleep and labor. Slaves shuffled out from the quarters, wooden cabins that smelled of sweat, mildew, and the damp earth beneath. Children cried, women wrapped scraps of cloth around their heads, men bent their backs before the overseer's whip demanded it. Harriet remembered every sound, the coughs, the moans, the silence after lashes cracked. The Whitmore plantation was not the largest in Tennessee, but it was cruel. Thomas Whitmore believed order came from fear. He believed chains were lighter than kindness. He believed in the whip more than the Bible he quoted on Sundays. Harriet was moved into the kitchen at 16, not as a kindness, but as a punishment. She had tried to shield her brother Elijah when he was whipped, her body thrown over his back, her scream echoing. Thomas Whitmore had dragged her away himself. "If you love blood so much, girl, you'll cook with it," he said. And from that day forward, she was in the house. The kitchen smelled of smoke, grease, iron. The big house smelled of perfume and wine. The line between them was Harriet, carrying trays from one world to the other. She didn't cry, she just worked, she just remembered. Every day in the Whitmore kitchen was a performance. Harriet's hands kneaded dough, chopped onions, stirred pots. Her face stayed low, her voice muted, but her mind was never quiet. She saw how Margaret Whitmore, the mistress, looked at her like dirt even while eating the food Harriet cooked. She saw how Jonathan Pike, the visiting planter, touched the house girl's arms as if choosing meat. She saw how overseers like William Harker spat tobacco into the kitchen fire while demanding more drink. They called her Harriet, but rarely with her name. Girl, cook, slave. She carried their words like stones, but she did not let them sink her. She tucked them away. She saved them. There was no mercy in the Whitmore household. Eliza, a young girl of 12, had once spilled cider on the mistress's gown. Margaret made her kneel on corn kernels for hours until her knees bled raw. Harriet remembered the sound of Eliza's quiet sobbing in the dark that night. She remembered the way Margaret laughed about it later. Ruth, Harriet's sister, had once been caught trying to hide bread, starving, desperate, caught. She was whipped until she collapsed, never rising again, buried behind the cabins without a marker. Harriet whispered her name every night. Ruth, Ruth, Ruth. The kitchen knives Harriet used every day had more than one meaning. To Margaret, they were tools for carving meat. To Harriet, they were reminders that steel could cut more than pork. The pestle she used for herbs was not just for flavor. It was heavy enough to crush bone. The bottles on the shelves, some filled with vinegar, some with medicine, some with rat poison, were lessons waiting in silence. The years hardened her, but they also sharpened her. The 4th of July was always the grandest day on the Whitmore plantation. White families came from miles away. Harriet remembered each feast, the fireworks exploding overhead while slaves were forbidden to look. The laughter of men who held whips in one hand and wineglasses in the other. The irony pressed down heavier than the Tennessee heat. Freedom, celebrated by those who denied it to others. In the quarters at night, whispers spread. Whispers of revolt. Whispers of Nat Turner, of rebellions in Virginia, of slaves who had taken fire into their own hands. Harriet listened. She never spoke, but she listened. Samuel once told her, "Silence is the strongest sound we have. They fear what they cannot hear." Samuel, who later died under Harker's lash, left those words like embers in Harriet's chest. She never forgot them. The Whitmores thought Harriet's silence meant submission, but silence was not surrender. Silence was a seed. By 1848, Harriet had lived 10 years in the kitchen. She knew every smell, every crack in the wooden floorboards, every shadow cast by candlelight. She knew which bottles on the shelves were harmless and which were deadly. She knew who drank, the most who ate first, who demanded extra servings. 10 people would sit at the Independence Day feast. Thomas Whitmore, Margaret Whitmore, their sons, Robert and James, their daughters, Annabel and Clara, overseer William Harker, planter, Jonathan Pike, neighbor Samuel Reed, and Margaret's visiting sister Elizabeth Carroll. 10 names, 10 mouths. The kitchen was fire and iron. The feast was laughter and cruelty. Harriet was the bridge, and bridges can burn. 1 for Dinah, 1 for Elijah, 1 for Ruth, 1 for Rachel, 1 for Eliza, 1 for Samuel. The names pressed, heavier with each year. By 1848, they were no longer just memories, they were instructions, they were reasons. Not because she wanted vengeance for its own sake, but because silence had been long enough. The knife wasn't for meat. It was for something else. The bottles weren't for medicine, they were for something else. The feast wasn't for freedom, it was for something else. And Harriet was ready to listen to the silence inside her and finally let it speak. Memory never fades. It lingers in the body. It lingers in the skin, in the bones, in the taste of blood left behind by a whip. Harriet carried memory like a cloak. She carried wounds that never healed. Her earliest wound was Dinah, her mother. Dinah had skin dark as rich soil, voice soft as river water. She used to hum while working the cotton fields, small songs that made children laugh, even when the overseer's shadow passed over them. Dinah had hands that braided Harriet's hair under the moonlight, hands that held her steady when hunger made her knees weak. But when Harriet was 14, Dinah was sold. No warning, no mercy, no goodbye beyond the chains clinking as she was dragged away. Harriet had screamed, clinging to her mother's dress until Thomas Whitmore tore her off. Dinah's voice cried out one last time, "Remember me, Harriet. Remember." And Harriet did, every day. The wound deepened when her brother Elijah tried to run. He was 17, strong, fast. He believed he could make it north. He believed in freedom more than he feared death. But he was caught within 2 days. They whipped him in front of everyone. Overseer William Harker counted each strike, 40 lashes, then 50, then 60, until Elijah's back was shredded like torn fabric. Harriet had begged to shield him, had thrown her own body across his. Harker laughed, and Thomas Whitmore dragged her into the house, punishing her with kitchen labor instead of field labor. Elijah did not live through the week. Harriet whispered his name every morning after that. Elijah, Elijah, Elijah. Her sister Ruth was quiet, gentle. Ruth had dreams of learning letters. She used to trace patterns in the dirt, shapes she had seen in the master's books. "Words are freedom," she once told Harriet. But Ruth was caught stealing bread from the kitchen. She had been starving. They whipped her in the field. Her body broke before her spirit did. Harriet buried her with her own hands behind the cabins, no marker, only a small pile of stones. Ruth, Ruth, Ruth. Rachel was taken. She was only 15 when Jonathan Pike dragged her into the woods. She came back hollow, her eyes emptied. Within months, she hanged herself in the cabin, a strip of cloth tied around the rafters. Harriet had cut her down with her own hands. Rachel, Rachel, Rachel. Eliza, only 12, punished for spilling cider, forced to kneel until her knees bled. She died of fever not long after. Margaret Whitmore had laughed at her clumsiness, even as the child's body was buried in the soil. Eliza, Eliza, Eliza. Samuel, who whispered of silence, who believed that rebellion lived in quiet moments. Samuel, who told Harriet, "They fear what they cannot hear." Samuel whipped until his life left him in gasps. Samuel, Samuel, Samuel. Harriet carried all of them, not because she chose to, but because the world carved them into her, each wound a name, each name a reason. The kitchen became her prison, but also her sanctuary of thought. She remembered how Dinah's voice sounded when she hummed. She remembered Elijah's laughter before the whip stole it. She remembered Ruth's drawings in the dirt, Rachel's fragile smile, Eliza's small hands, Samuel's wisdom. Memory burned hotter than fire. She never cried in front of them. Not Thomas Whitmore, not Margaret, not Harker, not Pike. She didn't give them the sound of her grief. She gave them silence. And silence was sharper than any scream. They called, the scars on her back punishment. But Harriet knew the truth. They weren't punishment, they were maps. They were guides carved into her skin, pointing towards something she could not yet see but always felt. The Whitmores never saw it. They never looked at Harriet beyond the food she brought, beyond the silence she carried. But every day she lived. In their house, every day she stood over the fire, stirring pots and chopping herbs. She was studying, learning, remembering. They called the bottles in the kitchen medicine. But Harriet knew some were poison, rat poison, bitter and deadly. She had seen what it did to vermin. She had seen how quickly silence fell on them after one bite. She never touched it then. She just remembered. They called the knives tools for carving pork. But Harriet knew knives cut flesh no matter whose flesh it was. She never used them then. She just remembered. They called the feast a celebration of freedom. But Harriet knew it was a mask for cruelty. She never interrupted then. She just remembered. Memory was her weapon. Memory was her shield. Memory was her fire. When the fireworks burst overhead each year, Harriet's silence grew heavier. The sound of rockets and laughter was supposed to mean liberty. To Harriet, it was mockery. Fire in the sky while chains clinked in the dirt. She never looked up. She never smiled. She just remembered. Dinah, Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. One for each name, one for each wound. By 1848, Harriet had no illusions left. There was no mercy coming from the Whitmores. There was no kindness hidden in Margaret's stern smile. There was no justice in Thomas's prayers on Sunday. There was no life in Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, or Samuel anymore. But there was still Harriet, and Harriet remembered. The wounds had shaped her. The losses had molded her. The silence had sharpened her. Not because she wanted pity, not because she wanted tears, but because wounds demand answers. And the Independence Day feast of 1848 would be her answer. The summer of 1848 was hotter than most. The Tennessee air felt heavy, thick, pressing against the skin like a hand that would not let go. The fields shimmered with white cotton under a cruel sun. The air buzzed with cicadas, but Harriet's silence cut sharper than their song. The breaking point came quietly, not with fireworks, not with thunder, but with a tray. It was late June, days before the great feast. Harriet was carrying a tray of food into the Whitmore dining room. Margaret sat at the table with Annabel and Clara, the daughters, laughing. At a visiting guest story, Thomas Whitmore was reading a newspaper, glasses perched on his nose. Harriet's hands were steady as she carried the tray. She placed the dishes down without a word. Annabel laughed too hard, elbowing the tray. A bowl of stew spilled onto the tablecloth. Not much, just a splash, but Margaret's face turned sharp as glass. "Clumsy girl," she snapped. Her voice cut through the room. She grabbed Harriet by the wrist. Nails dug into skin. "You've ruined the cloth. Do you know how much this cost?" Harriet stood still. Her eyes lowered. Silence wrapped around her like armor. Margaret raised her hand. Slap. The sound echoed through the room, not because of pain, but because of insult. Harriet didn't cry. She just stood there. Thomas lowered his paper. "Margaret, enough," he muttered. But Margaret wasn't done. "Sometimes I think we should have left her in the fields," she hissed. "Kitchen work is wasted on her kind. Useless. Always useless." The daughters laughed. The guest smiled uncomfortably. Harriet stood, hand stinging, silence burning, and something cracked inside her. Not because of the slap, not because of the insult, but because she remembered. She remembered Dinah's voice crying out when chains dragged her away. She remembered Elijah's body shredded under the whip. She remembered Ruth's blood on the dirt, Rachel's hollow eyes, Eliza's small hands, Samuel's whisper, "They fear what they cannot hear." The slap was not just Margaret's hand. It was every lash, every chain, every burial without a marker. It was centuries carried in one strike. That night Harriet lay awake in the quarters. The heat pressed down. The air smelled of sweat and dirt. Children cried softly in the dark. But Harriet's silence was deeper. She stared at the rafters. She stared at her hands. Hands that cooked, carried, cleaned. Hands that had buried too many. Hands that had never shaken when slicing meat or pouring wine. The kitchen fire had taught her patience. The kitchen knives had taught her precision. The bottles on the shelf had whispered their secrets. Rat poison, bitter, white, deadly. She thought of the Independence Day feast. 10 white mouths, 10 seats at the table, 10 reasons. Her silence shifted. It was no longer a shield. It was a blade. She rose before dawn, moving to the kitchen before the others stirred. The fire glowed faint in the pit. The smell of smoke clung to her dress. She opened the cabinet, fingers brushing over bottles until she found it. A small glass jar, harmless to those who didn't know, deadly to those who did. She held it in her hand, heavy, cold, final. The poison wasn't for rats anymore. It was for something else. She tucked it back on the shelf, heart steady. She was not ready that morning, not yet, but the seed had sprouted. The days leading to the 4th of July moved slow. Harriet's silence deepened. She worked with the same precision, but now every motion had double meaning. She chopped vegetables, imagining how easily the knife could cut flesh. She stirred broth, imagining bitter powder dissolving in the steam. She carried trays, imagining the weight of fate balanced on her palms. The other slaves didn't see it, or maybe they did, but said nothing. Silence was survival, and Harriet's silence was louder than words. The night before the feast, fireworks were tested in the yard. Bursts of light against the dark sky. The white families clapped and cheered. Harriet stood in the kitchen doorway, fire reflecting in her eyes. Freedom for them, chains for her. Not for long. She whispered the names. Again, Dinah, Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. Each name a heartbeat. Each name a reason. She looked at her hands again. They didn't tremble, they never did. She didn't cry, she just remembered. And the silence inside her sharpened into decision. The breaking point had come. The feast would not be a celebration of freedom. It would be her reckoning. One for Dinah, one for Elijah, one for Ruth, one for Rachel, one for Eliza, one for Samuel. 10 seats at the table, 10 white mouths, 10 reasons. The silence was no longer waiting. The silence was ready. The night was thick with heat, stars hidden behind a gauze of smoke from fireworks. July 3rd bled into July 4th, and the Whitmore estate pulsed with preparation. Servants moved like ants, polishing silver, pressing linens, hanging garlands of red, white, and blue. The air itself seemed to hum with celebration, but in the kitchen Harriet moved with a different rhythm. Her silence was no longer stillness. It was motion, measured and deliberate. She lit the fire early, the crackle of wood sounding like whispers of the past. Shadows stretched long against the brick walls. The smell of smoke, onions, and roasting meat filled the air. But beneath it all another scent lingered, sharp, bitter, the scent of powder hidden inside a jar. Harriet opened the pantry door. Her eyes landed on it, the small glass jar, harmless to eyes that did not know, deadly to those who did. She reached for it, fingers steady. For a moment she paused, not out of fear, out of memory. She saw Dinah's face, chains cutting into her wrists. She heard Elijah's cry as the whip cracked, Ruth's silence as she fell, Rachel's eyes, hollow, Eliza's, small hands trembling, Samuel's whisper, "They fear what they cannot hear." Harriet's silence carried them all. She set the jar on the counter. Light flickered against the glass. The feast menu stretched before her, roast duck, honey ham, stew thick with vegetables. Biscuits, pies, wine, 10 seats at the long table, 10 white mouths, 10 reasons. Her hand brushed across each dish in her mind. She knew who favored what. She knew which cup Annabel always claimed, which slice of ham Thomas reached for first, how Margaret demanded extra gravy. She did not need to guess. She had watched. She had remembered. And remembering was power. The other kitchen slaves came and went. Some stirred pots. Some kneaded dough. Some scrubbed pans. They spoke in hushed voices, eyes always darting. Harriet said nothing. Her silence was command enough. They left her to the sauces, to the bottles, to the final touches. She unsealed the jar. A fine white powder, bitter on the tongue. She dipped her fingers, just enough to feel the weight. A pinch was death. A spoonful was certain. The powder disappeared into the broth, dissolving, vanishing, no trace left but certainty. She stirred slowly, carefully, as if folding memory into the pot. For Annabel's cup, she prepared the wine. A smile tugged faintly at her lips. Annabel always demanded the first pour, always lifted her glass higher than anyone else, always wanted to be seen. She would be seen for the last time. The fire popped in the hearth. Shadows jumped across Harriet's face. The night stretched long, every motion stretched thin with tension. Yet Harriet did not falter. Her silence was steady. Her silence was ready. Near midnight, she stepped outside for air. The yard was lit by lanterns strung for the celebration. Laughter carried from the main house where guests had already begun to gather. Harriet stood alone, breathing in the heavy night. She looked up at the sky. No stars, only smoke. Her lips did not move, but inside her head, names circled like a chant. Dinah, Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. The fireworks would come tomorrow, bright colors against the sky. But Harriet was preparing her own fire. Quiet, invisible, deadlier than any rocket. She returned to the kitchen, sealing the jar once more. The dishes stood ready, covered with cloth. The poison rested inside, folded into flavor, invisible as silence. And in that silence, Harriet gathered her fire. She sat by the hearth, staring at the flames until dawn. The morning of July 4th broke loud and restless. Trumpets from town, laughter spilling down the Whitmore driveway, guests arriving in carriages. The big house swelled with perfume, silk dresses, polished boots. Voices filled every hall. But in the kitchen, Harriet's silence ruled. She lifted trays. She adjusted bowls. She checked each dish, her eyes sharp, her hands precise. The powder was invisible, but Harriet could see it. Harriet could feel it. By noon the table was set, 10 seats gleaming under the chandelier, silver polished, crystal sparkling, garlands draped along the walls. Independence Day, they called it. Independence for them, chains for her. Not for long, the guests laughed. Margaret barked orders. Thomas drank early. Annabel twirled in her dress. Clara clapped at the sound of more fireworks outside. Harriet stood at the doorway, tray balanced in her hands. Her face was still, her silence unbroken. One by one she placed the dishes, the roast, the stew, the ham, the wine. 10 white mouths. 10 reasons. Each movement was a prayer, each dish a name. Dinah, Elijah, Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. Her silence filled the room. None of them noticed. None of them ever did. The fire had been gathered. Now it only waited. The feast began. July 4th, 1848. Noon sun pouring through the windows of the Whitmore estate. Firecrackers burst outside, smoke trailing across the fields. Drums from town carried faintly on the wind. The air was swollen with pride and noise. But at the long table inside, Harriet's silence lingered. The family and their guests lifted glasses. Annabel raised hers first, laughing, pearls at her throat catching the light. Margaret called for prayer. Thomas muttered something about freedom. Freedom. The word twisted in Harriet's chest like a knife. The wine shimmered red in the crystal. Cups, red like memory, red like Ruth's back torn by whips, red like the flames that took Rachel, red like silence when it hardens into rage. Annabel sipped first. She always did. Her lips touched the rim, swallowed, laughed again. No one noticed Harriet's eyes, steady on her. Plates were filled, roast carved, stew ladled, ham passed down. The room filled with clatter and chatter, forks against porcelain, knives scraping bone. Harriet moved like a shadow behind them. Silent, watchful. Every pour, every slice, every refill deliberate. Her silence was a thread pulling the feast tighter, closer to its breaking point. The first cough came quick. Annabel. Her laughter caught. A small sound, sharp against the din. She pressed a hand to her chest. A cough, then 2. Her smile faltered. Wine spilled against her dress. Margaret scolded her for being clumsy. Thomas barked with laughter. Clara rolled her eyes. Harriet said nothing. She stood by the sideboard, hands folded, face calm. Her silence was not absence. It was presence. It filled the room more than their noise. The second cough came harder. Annabel doubled over. Silver clattered as she dropped her fork. Her pearls broke, scattering across the floor. White beads rolling like bones. Margaret's chair screeched back. "Annabel!" she shouted. But Harriet already knew. The silence inside her broke into rhythm. One, Annabel. The stew moved next. Mr. Whitmore himself, the master of the house, spoon halfway to his mouth, paused. His hand shook. His face paled. Sweat broke along his brow. He dropped the spoon. The broth spread across the tablecloth, soaking into red, white, and blue. His eyes bulged. His throat convulsed. He gasped. A terrible sound, half scream, half silence. Then he fell sideways, chair toppling beneath him. Two. Mr. Whitmore. Panic flared. Chairs scraped. Voices rose. Clara shouted for water. Margaret screamed orders at it. The servants. Thomas swore, grabbing his father's shoulders. Harriet moved quietly among them, her tray steady in her hands. She offered nothing. She gave no cure. Her silence was sharper than any blade. The third fell when the ham returned down the table. A cousin. His name lost in their laughter, his importance drowned in land deeds and cotton. He swallowed thickly, then gagged. His face purpled. He clawed at his throat until blood streaked his lips. Three. The cousin. The room became chaos. Silver crashed to the floor. Glass shattered. The chandelier shook as bodies lurched, stumbled, collided. The sound of their feast twisted into screams. Harriet's silence cut through it all. Margaret turned, eyes wide, fury mixing with terror. "You! Bring water!" she ordered Harriet, voice cracking. Harriet did not move. She stood still, her hands folded, her back straight. Not because she was afraid, because she was finished obeying. The fourth victim choked on his biscuit. The fifth collapsed across his plate. The sixth clutched his stomach, rolling to the floor as foam bubbled from his mouth. One for Dinah, one for Elijah. One for Ruth, one for Rachel, one for Eliza, one for Samuel. Their names pounded in Harriet's chest with every fall. Her silence was no longer still. It was a drumbeat, steady, relentless. Annabel writhed on the carpet, pearls scattered like spilled teeth. Margaret shrieked, clutching her daughter. Thomas staggered backward, sweat pouring, hand pressed to his mouth. Clara sobbed into her napkin, face white as linen. The fireworks outside cracked loud, drowning some of the screams. But inside the true fire was unfolding. Harriet walked slowly to the head of the table. She picked up the wine bottle. It gleamed dark in the light. She poured herself a glass, careful, deliberate. Her hand did not shake. She raised the glass, not to drink but to hold. "This is for Dinah," she whispered inside her silence. She did not need to speak aloud. The room was already listening. One by one, the poison claimed them. 10 seats filled with noise an hour earlier, now sagged under silence. 10 mouths that laughed at chains, now slack with foam. 10 hands that cracked whips, now curled lifeless against linen. The Independence. Day feast ended in silence. Smoke from fireworks drifted through the open windows. The smell of roasted ham mixed with bile and blood. The garlands drooped, the chandelier flickered, and Harriet stood among them, calm, steady, silent. Not a victim, not a servant, something else entirely. The house had never been so quiet. The feast was over. The room lay broken. Plates overturned, wine spilled like blood, pearls scattered across the carpet. The chandelier still burned, but its light felt dim, pale against the shadows that now ruled the house. 10 bodies, 10 reasons. Outside, fireworks still cracked against the Tennessee sky. Red, white, and blue sparks burst above the fields, but their noise felt distant, hollow. The true explosion had already happened, silent and unseen, in the veins and stomachs of the Whitmore family. Harriet stood at the head of the table. Her hands rested on the wood polished by years of slavery, by years of her silence. She looked at the faces slumped before her, Annabel, pearls torn, dress stained. Margaret, mouth twisted in shock, arms wrapped around nothing. Thomas, eyes frozen wide as if even death couldn't close them. Clara, silent at last. Harriet did not cry. She did not shake. She breathed, slow, steady. For the first time in her life, the air felt hers. She remembered Dinah. She remembered Elijah. She remembered Ruth, Rachel, Eliza, Samuel. Every lash, every scream, every silence forced upon them. Tonight was one for each of them. Tonight the silence spoke. The other servants had long since fled the kitchen, hiding in corners of the quarters, too afraid to breathe. They heard the screams. They smelled the poison. They knew Harriet had moved differently these past days. None dared stop her. None dared join her. But now, as the house fell quiet, some crept closer. Faces at the doorway, wide eyes peering at the scene. They did not speak. They only stared. They saw Harriet standing straight, calm, still. They saw what silence could do when sharpened. The first to step inside was Esther, a girl no older than 14. She stared at the bodies, then at Harriet. Her lips trembled, but no words came. Harriet met her eyes. Just a look. Just silence. But in that silence, a seed was planted. Esther would never forget. The sun tilted low outside. Evening spread across the estate. Fireworks gave way to torches, music from town floating faint on the air. But the Whitmore house did not join. Its windows glowed faint, but no laughter spilled out. Its silence was heavy, suffocating, final. By nightfall, the news spread. Riders carried whispers to nearby plantations. The Whitmores are dead. All 10. Poison in the feast, poison in the wine. A slave did it. A woman did it. Harriet. Her name carried like smoke, curling across Tennessee. By midnight, dogs barked, lanterns bobbed along the road, riders approached, fast, furious. Harriet heard them before she saw them, hooves pounding, voices shouting, chains clinking. She did not run, she did not hide. The others begged her. Esther grabbed her hand, tears spilling. "Please," she whispered, voice breaking. But Harriet shook her head. Not because she wanted to die, because she had already done what she came to do. Running would not erase it. Chains would not silence it. The story was already free. When the riders burst through the door, guns raised, Harriet stood at the head of the table still. Her dress stained with smoke and stew, her eyes sharp, her silence unbroken. They dragged her out, chains clamping around her wrists, iron biting into skin already scarred by years of rope and lash. She did not resist. She did not beg. She only looked once more at the house, at the table, at the fire inside the hearth. Her silence said enough. The trial was swift, if it could be called a trial. 10 dead whites. 1 enslaved woman accused. No jury needed. No defense allowed. The verdict was written before her name was spoken. Guilty. Execution. They chained her to the gallows weeks later. The crowd gathered, sweating under the August sun. Some cursed, some spat. Some whispered her name like a ghost, Harriet, Harriet of Tennessee, the slave who poisoned 10 at the Independence Day feast. She stood tall, rope itching against her neck. Her eyes scanned the crowd, faces blurred, but one stood clear. Esther. Hidden in the back, eyes burning. Harriet's gaze held hers. Silence passed between them, a silence heavier than any sermon. The hangman asked for last words. Harriet opened her mouth. For a moment the crowd leaned forward, but no sound came. She didn't cry. She didn't plead. She just breathed. The lever fell. Her body swung heavy against the sun, but her silence did not die. It traveled, whisper to whisper, plantation to plantation. They called her wicked. They called her monster. But among the enslaved, her name became something else, a seed, a spark. Children whispered her story by firelight. Women hummed it under their breath while washing clothes. Men carved her initials in wood. Harriet, not just a name, a lesson. They called it poison, but it was really resistance. They called it murder, but it was really memory. They called it silence, but it was really fire. Years later, when war broke across the South, when chains cracked open and fields burned, some remembered the woman who had struck her own blow long before. Not with a gun, not with an army, but with silence, sharpened into fire. The Whitmore estate never recovered. The house was abandoned, left to rot. Weeds split the foundation. Vines crept over the walls. Locals whispered it was cursed, not by ghosts, but by silence. The silence of Harriet, still breathing through the cracks. If this story haunts, it is because silence remembers. Harriet's silence was not weakness. It was weapon. Her silence was not absence. It was presence. Her silence was not death. It was memory. And memory does not hang. Memory does not burn. Memory does not die. Harriet of Tennessee lives still, not in chains, not in gallows, but in every story whispered when the night is thick, when the fire burns low, when silence feels heavier than words. Her silence was her weapon. Her silence was her fire. Her silence was her freedom. If this story burns inside you, it is because Harriet's silence still speaks. Subscribe and share this story with those who carry memory. Because silence, once sharpened, never fades.